Well, welcome everyone to another OpFocus webinar on advanced RevOps. Today we'll be talking about reporting to the board. This is a topic I hear so much about across all these years, and it's amazing with all the technology how little of it has changed and how critical this one action is for not just RevOps teams, but entire organizations. To tell you a little bit about OpFocus, so we're a revenue operations consulting shop. We work with SaaS companies to optimize revenue operations. We're in our 16th year. We're spread out across the US and Canada, and boy, what a thrill it is to help organizations scale their operations. So during the session today, we absolutely welcome your questions. You can use the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of them as we can. If we don't get to some, we'll look to follow up after the session. So absolutely welcome questions, and so glad that you're all here with us today. It's great to see so many friendly faces. All right, today we have an amazing panel. I'm so thrilled and honored to have Lauren Kelley and Kate MacKenzie with us. Lauren and I have known each other for probably 20 years now, Lauren. We served on a board together, but Lauren is the founder and CEO of OPEXEngine. Lauren and her team survey and anonymize and share SaaS operating metrics. They also collect sales operations metrics as well. Kate MacKenzie is the VP of Revenue Ops at Onapsis. Kate, I think it's been over a decade since we first met, so it's really been fun to stay in touch with you all these years and just see all the great things that you've been up to. So congrats on your new role. So happy to have you both with us today.
Thanks, David. Hasn't been 20 years, but great to know you for all this time and see the growth of OpFocus. It's been terrific.
Okay, all right. I guess the mind stretches things over time.
It probably has. I'm just saying it hasn't.
So to get us started, I'd love to ask you both to tell us about your recent experience with board metrics. Perhaps Lauren, you might start for us.
Sure. Thanks, David. Yeah. So my experience with board metrics is a couple of things. So before I started OPEXEngine, I was an officer of a company here in the Boston area called Art Technology Group, ATG, which went public and then was later acquired by Oracle. So at that point, we were in, from 4 million to 160 million. We were in incredibly fast growth. We went public at, around 50 million. And then did 160 million. So it was all about revenue growth, market access, or market leadership. And being the difference between being a public company and a private company was super interesting as well. And then with OPEXEngine, we work with hundreds and hundreds of software and SaaS companies with their finance organizations and with CFOs. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting, and maybe we can talk about it later, is the difference when you're acquired by another company, and particularly a big company, in a different business, an adjacent business, how that changes the story, how that changes the metrics. And it's usually a very abrupt change. And so I can give my example. I ran OPEXEngine as an independent private company for 15 years, from founding through now. OPEXEngine, I'm still the CEO of OPEXEngine, but OPEXEngine's now owned by Bain & Company, one of the world's largest consulting firms. So I now have a board, in effect, of a few individuals from Bain who act as sort of the board. And now I'm reporting to people who aren't necessarily running, SaaS companies. They're used to running professional services. So we're in the process of figuring out what the right metrics are. But, in the initial phase, I have to get used to the fact that their interests are sort of different than my interest of running a SaaS company. It's They haven't asked me for utilization rates, which is a nice thing, because that's a typical professional services question. But
Sure.
it's much more about expenses, profitability, governance, those kind of things. And SaaS companies are usually all about growth. And I think that's something that we'll talk about here, but it's sort of my launch point for this conversation.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Such a shift. A lot of times we think of, new analytics tool, maybe an acquisition, and that changes things, or new systems, other changes in the business that impact reporting, but a new owner, certainly with different needs. How about for you, Kate?
Sure. I'm so happy to be here. So we actually met David when I was in a Salesforce admin class. I think it was in 2007 that we first met, which is when I actually left the sports world and came into the tech world. So my experience has been working with people like Lauren to actually build the slides. And I came up through being an analyst. I was working at Brightcove in 2007, and which is a SaaS online video platform company. We were a startup back then. I think I was the 86 hire, so true, startup life there, and grew through when we IPO'd in 2012. So, there was many iterations of that company and the way that we reported out on our metrics and the way we looked at things. And then I left and I went to a startup out in Framingham called Applause. And again, there was no sales operations RevOps at that point. So we kind of changed the way. That's when you put in process and you put in metrics, is when, I kind of show up, that's what happens. And then I actually went back to Brightcove in a much different place where we had been public for years, and we had C-levels that were coming from these really large companies where I've only had startup experience. So seeing how they managed board slides, and the board was completely different than something I've ever seen. And just how involved the board was in, joining our SCO, our sales kickoff, and you'd see them around the office a lot more than in my past companies. So that experience was completely different. And the way that we interacted with them and how I interacted, because I was joining at a much higher position than, being an analyst. And now I've been at Onapsis for 2 months now, haven't been a part of a board meeting yet or had to build slides, but I'm looking forward to contributing to this conversation with, being on the tactical side and the person who's actually crunching the numbers and putting together the deck, and then moving into a position where working with the C-levels on what that story is that we want to tell and how we do that. So
this is great. We can have a follow-up session with you as you assemble now for Onapsis. But how interesting doing it for both private and public. That is a topic I feel we'll come back to. For both of you, I'm very interested in selecting the right metrics to present. So this is a big topic. Lauren, you touched on it with your change. Perhaps you could share with us how you suggest folks on RevOps teams at SaaS companies, how they work on whittling down the list, because they can't show everything. So how do they pick and choose?
Yeah, I think the fundamental message is that the board reporting should follow a narrative and a story, and it's different at different stages of the company. So it's both the stage of the company and then also the goals of the company, because the board's job is to provide the sort of outside in management of the company and make sure that it's moving towards its goals, and not get caught up in the day-to-day tactical kind of things, but see what the results of that and whether you're making that forward movement towards the goal. So in an early stage, it's really about making sure that the company is finding that product market traction, or product market fit and customer traction. So they're going to be looking more at conversion rates for customers. They're going to look at engagement through Google Analytics with the product. They're going to be looking at, and then of course the major thing in the early stage is cash flow. Is there enough money? What's the runway? Is there a need to start the process for funding? Because you can't, when you're going to run out of money in 3 months, you can't start the whole process right then. So those are kind of the core things. And then at the growth stage, you're looking at, you should have found a product market fit and some customer traction. So now you're starting to look at retention rates, and you're starting to look at also, the growth. So month to month or quarter to quarter or year over year growth rates, new customer adds, those kind of differentiation of numbers like new versus renewal versus expansion are all metrics that are really important, and to see that over time. And of course, cash flow still is important. And then when you get into the enterprise stage, it's more about, you have all these employees, and that's a huge cost. It's a huge asset. It's a huge, value of your company. So you're looking much more at employee productivity and employee retention rates. And in the current market that we're talking about, everybody's board and every company in the tech space that I know of is looking at, how many open recs, how long, what's the time it takes to hire somebody and get them started. How many, there's new metrics out there like new hires that have left within the first 90 days. So that's a good indicator of both your hiring process, whether you're hiring the right people, right fit, and also whether you're, supporting them properly.
With the
So
onboarding.
those are the kind of things. And then you get into an acquisition, or, or you're moving towards selling the company, or you're moving towards IPO. You want to be telling the story of how are you progressing to get there. So again, what are the metrics that you need to show that story, and then working backwards is what I've seen.
Oh, that's so interesting. How about for you, Kate?
Oh, Lauren, you really summed it all up from all the different stages. So I'm focused on always the sales part of the board deck. So just going off of what Lauren said is, in growth mode, it's the trends, right? It's the top line trends of ARR and retention of customers, even going into like sales cycle and average selling price as you're starting to start planning for the next year. So like typically we would have those stats in, but towards the end of the year, it's kind of the recap of how you're seeing that progression and where you think you're going to go in the following year. And even beyond metrics a little bit is programs, like any programs, because you always have the past board meetings, right? And the board slides. And you have to remember what you presented on back then, because you have to present on them again, unless you're going to do a pivot, which for anyone that's been in that position, it's a scary thing as an analyst, because you have to tell the story about why you're now going to change. Like, for example, we looked at a particular set of industries that in verticals we were targeting. We decided to shift them a little bit. So then you have to plan out what that looks like, and then how you start to tell the story around why you're doing that. What are the metrics that help you tell that story? Because everything has to have metrics around it. It can't just be a story. You have to show them why and then what you're going to do. And I think the other part of metrics too is like, if you're trending and you actually are having incredible growth in an area, you're seeing something really good, you got to tell them why, and you have to make sure you can then continue to replicate that. Or you have to make sure that you're saying, here's some risk areas of like, we think this was an anomaly because of COVID, but even on a downward trend, you also have to figure out why you're seeing that downward trend and what you're going to do to then fix that, which can be programs or training or, all sorts of areas, investment in software, technology. So there's more metrics that go on top of it based on the trending that you're seeing. And then, then if you're like launching new products and it's about innovation and what that looks like, and then NPS can start to be involved in it when you start asking your customers about, would they recommend you? And so it can really have a spider effect, but it's making sure that it all is about that story and the metrics that tell that story. Because if you're in a company meeting, you go deep on details sometimes. At the board meeting, you have to stay really high level and you don't want to go too deep. You want to say the right things with the backup of the metrics, but kind of keep it more high level. Because remember, they're not the same audience that you talk to every single day, where they're going to, they may dig in. So in our board slides, we have an index of a ton of slides that if they're going to ask that, we have this graph to show them why. Or if they're going to ask about this competitor information has been really big topics in some of my past board meetings of like, all right, well, why are we losing to them, or why are we winning against them? What does this look like for any new product that we're introducing? I mean, there's a lot that goes into it, but staying high level, making sure that what your trends are doing, that you're having backup information on why you're seeing that and if that's going to continue or not. And then just remember that next quarter, you got to remember what you presented on because you have to speak to it again. So those are all the things that I keep in mind and my team keeps in mind as we build these. And when you're looking at metrics, it's really backing up the story. And there's proactive metrics where that's your storytelling, but then there's also reactive metrics that, we'll get notes from the CEO and the COO saying, hey, the board is asking about these specific things. We have to talk about the TAM, like total addressable market, for example, or this vertical and how we're doing here is because we talked about it last time, they'd like to see a follow-up on this. So that's the other layer of it is how can we be proactively telling a story that we want them to know? And then, reactive is what are the things we've done before and how do we continue to tell that story as well?
Sure. I think it's a perfect segue into our next topic, which is the process for preparing board metrics. Lauren, could we start with you on that? What have you seen over the years? How do we build trust into these metrics that we're preparing through a sound process? I'm curious about what you have to say.
Yeah, no, I think Kaitlin has a much better perspective on how the actual data is pulled together. But from a high level, one of the best practices that I've seen is a great CFO in the Bay Area, Eric Mersch, who is now working as a contract CFO. And he says every time he goes into a new company, the first thing he does is at the first board meeting, sit down and say, here's the metrics that I think we're going to be presenting on a regular basis. And here's how we calculate it. And we're not going to talk about that again until we have to say that we're going to calculate it slightly differently, and we'll give you the reason why. But it sort of cuts out that issue of, going forward because all of these operational metrics, there's so many different definitions out there and there's so much confusion about it. And there's a lot of politics around it and bias and all sorts of things. So he just cuts through that and has very efficient ways of handling the board from that. And then the second is another best practice from a great CFO, which is to always add benchmarks up front to provide context. So instead of letting people get off on conversations like, well, why isn't the growth rate here? Or why isn't, this, that? I'm working at this other company and they're doing this. And it's just provide the benchmarks. So you always have sort of guide rails to the conversation and it sets the expectations up front. And then it's just a matter, we work a lot. And I think, David, we've done some webinars in the past about the systems required to get from 20 to 200 million on, part of it's just making sure that there's a flow through from, the customer number in the sales system has to match the customer number in the financial system and in the recurring revenue, system. And it's not that easy because you can have different definitions of these things for different purposes. And that's so critical because you can't be spending all your time trying to manually pull that together just before the board meeting, even though a lot of, finance organizations end up doing that because finance is in the end, the one source of truth, but you want it to be implemented in a systematic way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kaitlin, who actually knows how to do that.
So it's almost like PTSD with board reporting is it's really stressful. It's really stressful to prepare these slides, and but you can get it done. You get it done every time, right? Like you make it happen. So it's a lot of meetings. It's clearing schedules. Ruslan, who I worked with before, he's actually on this call right now. We were chatting before this and just talking about, reminiscing about creating board slides. And it's, you got to clear your calendar. Is what you come up with on your version 1 is not going to be what is handed to the board. So it's a lot of meetings. So I've always reported into the head of sales. It's a lot of meetings with the CRO, the COO, and, reviewing. It's like you get your baseline metrics done, the metrics you've always reported, or updating the metrics from the prior board slides and just reviewing them. And then they are telling you what the rest of the company is also doing, right? So I typically have insight into the marketing piece and the sales piece. So because obviously our stories are tightly aligned, but there's HR and there's finance and there's product and there's these other teams that are also going to be presenting. So I'm used to working closely with the CRO or the COO with my team saying, okay, what's going on at a high level. Help us understand what is being told so that, yes, we have these metrics that we always present that we're updating, but what else is the story about, so that we can go help support that or provide more information, or at least so we're all aligned on the same corporate messaging that is going to be going out. So, it's a lot of digging into data. It's a lot of, running reports. It's long hours in that week, but typically it's a week before, right? Because board meetings are happening after a quarter close. So you're getting all your books closed, and then you have to put together these slides pretty shortly after. So it's really just a lot of time together as a team, and a lot of time with your leadership team to figure out what is that story you're telling, and then any changes, any requests the board has made, because sometimes we'll get requests from them on things that they want to see, like I mentioned before. And what we also try to do leading up to that is, we have meetings, company meetings and team meetings. Like I'm used to a team, the sales team gets together quarterly to go over, do like an all hands of how we prepare for the upcoming quarter. And within that, you find metrics, right, that you're presenting to your company throughout the year. And we make sure we bookmark things that are really interesting, like things that we find like, ooh, this will be good for the board meeting. We should at least bookmark this, build a Tableau dashboard or a Cleary dashboard so that we can easily automate this and keep an eye on it as we go. So that when we get to that board slide, we kind of have this running list of things that we have found interesting that might, depending on what that story is, might support. We try to replicate everything. There's always the one-off ad hoc reporting out of Excel that you're going to do, right? Like it's going to happen. But once we've done them, is trying to get them into Salesforce or Cleary or, InsightScore, whatever BI tool or data visualization tool that you have, so that you can manage it going forward to make it easier on you. Or sometimes it's just creating a really great Excel model that you just can dump your data into, and it will just update for you. You're going to have those late nights, and you're going to have the scrambling, and the day before the CRO coming to you and be like, hey, we need to tweak this. And it's like, as an analyst in the back of your head that it's not a tweak. That's going to take a couple hours of work to do that. But you just got to clear your schedule and just be ready for it. Because at the end, it's actually really gratifying to see the output of work that you're providing to the company. Yeah.
Oh, it's so interesting. Through hosting RevOps roundtables here at OpFocus, I hear pretty much every month over month, and I'm aware of who has board meetings coming up to prep, because that blocking off that time is so critically important. And I'd say very, very few heads of revenue operations can go into the board prep process calmly. That there is just a lot of time that has to be blocked off and conversations that have to be had. And I imagine in companies that are scaling, bringing on new executives into the fold, that there's a continuous education that has to occur around, okay, you might have done CAC this way in the past, or you might have calculated retention this way. This is how we're doing it. And you may share why, kind of like what Lauren shared before, just sort of like laying down the law. But I can imagine confusion as an organization just keeps growing and adds more senior folks on if the metrics aren't really clearly identified as part of that as well.
That is, and it's also your definitions at a company, like when you're presenting to your company at an all hands, the definitions of those metrics could be different than how you present them to the board. So making sure that you have a dictionary, like a metrics dictionary, that kind of has the different iterations of it, it's really important. And then exactly what you said, when someone comes on board, helping them understand how you do things at your current company, it's less confusing. So
yeah, great. All right, thank you both. On to our next topic. So I think you both have mentioned the topic around narrative. I'm curious, how do you shape the narrative around board metrics? And maybe you could pick one metric and talk about that, or just in general, that process of shaping the narrative. Lauren, what can you share with us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, again, I think in the first place, you start with the end goal in mind, because every company has a goal sort of in the next couple of years. And whether it's to get to a certain size, early stage, and, the sort of West Coast triple, double, model.
D3.
Exactly. Whether, I can't say it that quickly, because if I do, then I switch over to RT.
To D2.
What is it? RT. Too much Star Wars in my background. It's, if that's your goal and that's what your board's expecting, then that's how you figure out the narrative that you're telling. If the narrative, and that's something that really the CFO together with the CEO have to define, and working with the board, depending on, the structure of the board, whether they have a really close board where they're working very closely together, or whether there's a little bit of friction between the goals of, because you can have situations where you have a board with different investors on the board, and some of those investors may have different goals for the company than other investors, and also for the CEO. So it's a tricky situation, but that has to be defined at that level. And the CEO and the CFO have to work with the team and figure out, okay, this is what the story that we're trying to tell. I don't think that can come from, the bottom up. I think it has to come from the top down. And then you carve out the metrics that tell that story. I think referring back to Kaitlin's comment of sometimes you define metrics for the board differently than you define them for the company. I think in the best of all possible worlds, you have the same definitions. You may have different targets that you give the board than you give the company internally. I used to know a VC who'd been a CEO of a couple of companies who said he always had 3 different, sets of company numbers. One that he would, the numbers you give the board, you have to make those numbers absolutely, no matter what happens. That is like your, stake in the ground. The numbers that you set as a management team maybe can be a little bit more aggressive. And then the numbers that you give, the sales organization, that's kind of a traditional way of doing it. But other companies are just completely transparent. There's a great model to that as well. So
yeah,
different models work for different cultures of companies.
Yeah, I think we certainly see that with, budgeting or quotas, that internal number, or what's the bank number, kind of thing. How about for you, Kate?
So, so same as what Lauren said, is that the story comes from the C-level. And I think what helps the people who are building the decks is being curious, is hearing that story and then going into the data and really being curious about how we then look at that. And I think you always, if you're asking all these questions of like, okay, if this is where we're going, we need to talk, about, I guess the most common thing that is always a stressor is when you're trending in a great direction towards that goal. And then that one quarter it dips and it goes below, and you have to be able to tell why. And it's digging into that data and trying to look at it with all these different lenses to figure out, there's got to be a good story in there. It's not a great thing that it dipped. Also, if you're doing it quarterly over 2 years, like one dip is, you don't want to cause a fire either. You don't want it to be like set the alarms off and, we're down 3% and everyone, your hair's on fire. So you want to just start to ask the questions of like, obviously why we saw that dip, but let's start to look at this data a little bit differently than we're used to. Let's get really curious and say, all right, are we looking at it new versus expansion? Are we looking at it by region? Are we looking at it by vertical? Are we looking at it by product? Because then you start to find answers that you probably haven't been reporting on and that you probably will start to look at going forward. And you're realizing things that is it a competitor that's in there that hasn't been showing up lately or is now in there? Or is, what exactly is that? But it's about, for the people who have to support the story, it's about being really curious about it. And, that ends up being, 25 pivot tables and Excel sheet, but like it gets you to the point where you're just starting to really look at your business a little bit differently. And the dip may have caused that, but it's always a good thing because then it starts to be on your radar and it kind of shifts your vision a little bit. It doesn't mean you're always going to look at it that way, but it's really being curious because you can also provide more of a narrative for that C-level, as you can say, actually, I found this out and this, we may have had a dip, but this is actually a great opportunity for us. And like, here's the things that we can do to help get us back on track, or, it could lead to something else that ends up being really great. So like being curious about it as the people have to go and find the answers is how I think we participate in that, in that narrative.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And you need to leave yourself time in the process that we just talked about. So if you're spending all the time cobbling the metrics together, you're not getting that time to sort of swim in the data and really think about it and what it's telling you about the business. That's so interesting. Well, thank you both for that. To shift to the next topic, talking about, in the lifespan of an organization, as organizations grow, what factors can impact the metrics that might be included in the board presentation? Do you want to start on this one, Kate?
Sure. Well, one big impact that we've probably seen in the last 18 months is COVID. So that can really impact, anything that's going on in the world that may impact your business. Like I'm assuming a lot of companies have been impacted by, the shipping delays that we've been seeing. That probably impacts people. COVID has really impacted business. So how we look at what came out of that from my last company is we started looking at all of our customers and really focusing on our customer health and the industries that may be impacted by COVID and how we can get proactive and look ahead to that. So we did a whole presentation on where we think there's risk and how we're going to mitigate that for these customers. I'm trying to think of what, obviously we've talked about acquisitions that can impact how we look at board slides and, whether you include that or you don't include that. I typically don't for at least a year or two based on what kind of acquisition that you're making, tech buy versus the, product, whatever that is. Launching new products, that can impact how you look at that. You separate it out. So you have your high level metrics you continue to report on, but then you separate it out just to see how you like pipeline growth. How is it going for these new products? What are you seeing for conversion rates? And are you hitting, typically when you launch a new product, you have goals for pipeline, you have goals for what you're going to sell, you have goals for what that selling price should be. And then you're just measuring, you're basically telling the board against those metrics, if you're doing well or not. So those are, I think, that some of the big ones that I've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly with the acquisition, the decisions around year-over-year reporting, and how do we take this thing that we may not even sell anymore and include it in the year-over-year numbers, and where do we include it? Lauren, you're nodding your head. I know you've seen this quite a bit and you're going through it right now. What can you share?
Yeah, acquisitions are really complicated in terms of board reporting, because I think one of the things both Kaitlin and I have been talking about is just telling a consistent story, and acquisitions change the consistency of that. So here I'm talking more about you, the company, are acquiring companies and adding those companies to your numbers. It's pretty unusual. I don't think I've ever worked with a company where they acquired a company and the company was on all the same systems and measured everything exactly the same way. It doesn't happen. So you have to expect that not only, but theoretically, we all think, oh, we acquired this company, they had X revenue, and so now we're just going to add that revenue and we'll just see that bump or whatever, and we can do it with and without. Totally simple. But it's not like that, because once you get beyond just recognized revenue, which is maybe a consistently recognized, defined metric, everything else is going to be done differently. So not only are you adding numbers to it, but you're also having to sort of massage and figure out how to make it fit within your structure. So that's a story in and of itself that you need to be prepared when you have an acquisition. And I think the board, you know, they're going to want to see within the first quarter something about the new acquisition. They may not want to require that, you know, for a year or more that the sales numbers are perfectly integrated, but they're going to want to know what happened with this money we spent. And then in the other direction, I sort of referred to that in my introduction. If you as a company are acquired, it's usually what I hear most from CFOs and finance teams is the first year, sometimes it takes longer than that, of really trying to educate the acquirer, especially if you're a SaaS company and you're acquired by a traditional tech company or a traditional software company or acquired by a PE firm, even if that PE firm has acquired a lot of other SaaS companies. Just a lot of effort goes into education about, you know, what's necessary for your business, what are the different metrics that you have to track, and then trying to work within the, you know, bigger companies' infrastructure of their reporting, especially if they're a public company. They have to have things a certain way, which really won't fit at all with what you do. And so that's there's no perfect way of doing that except for to prepare for it up front and be prepared, you know, be ready to do that.
Oh, it's so interesting, all these different impacts. And, you know, I think a lot of times we're down at the systems level and you introduce new systems or new tools or new analytics tools, and there's this ripple effect through the process and the narrative and getting the numbers straight, making sure that they tie out. So such an interesting topic. Thank you both. For our sixth, next topic is bringing the board level metrics back down into the running of the organization. I mean, what a powerful thing to have similar metrics at the senior most level and have similar metrics down a level and down a level, and then have whatever that somebody, it could be an SDR, what their contribution is to that metric that's going up. I'm curious if you have any ideas on bringing board level metrics back down into the running of the organization. Kate, would you start on that one?
Sure. So having, you want to stay as close as you can to what you're normally reporting out on to the company. You want to stay. So one thing that in my last company we did that I appreciated so much is that we actually had scorecards for our reps. So all of our reps had 5 metrics. And then our VP level, our senior leadership for sales, they had their own metrics. And then we had our metrics for board reporting. And there was maybe 1 or 2 in each of those categories that was a little bit different. So like the rep scorecards, the sales leadership team had 1 or 2 that the reps didn't have. And then when we go up 1 more level, then there's a couple more metrics that the VPs didn't have that we would report out to the board. There, or maybe a couple more, maybe 3 or 4 additional. That's without layering on the storytelling and the additional metrics you're going to show, but staying close to it. And just to go back to what Lauren said earlier is you have the definitions, and yes, it might be slightly different how we look at it, but I agree. It's like you want to keep it as consistent as possible, because as you're preparing for them, you don't want to be running these manual reports all the time. You want to have your normal reporting structure and cadence so that it's not as stressful as you go into it, because there's always going to be more you have to provide that is going to be stressful. So those baseline metrics you just need to have in your normal cadence and normal, the way that you speak to the company. And the other thing that not every company I've been a part of has done this, but the last 2 companies I've been a part of actually speak to the company about how it went. Like, we presented to the board last week. They'd always do the company all hands after the board presentation. One, they were public, they couldn't actually talk about numbers before that they went to the street anyways. But then it was just really nice to get a recap of what happened. And so the whole company could understand what the board is seeing. Obviously, it's not completely what they see, but it's the high level points of here's what we report out. Here's what it's looking like. This is our how we spoke to the board about this. And it's just really nice for the company. I'm a part of building it, so I always knew, but for the rest of the company to have an understanding of, what it's like and what we say and what their expectations are and where we go from here now. And so that is another piece of it, is bringing it back to I know this question is specifically that, but
I think that's so powerful. And you think probably a lot of people on the call are preparing metrics, but aren't part of the meetings. Mm-hmm. And to even hear validation back or other feedback on what was presented in the direction of the company is really validating for all that work, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. And I think it's just incredibly important in the SaaS world, in the subscription world, because when you think about, we're moving from sort of traditional command and control worlds where departments were a little bit siloed and, information was a little bit siloed and it was sort of top down. And in the SaaS world, it requires the whole company working together in order to make the model work, because it's not just about sales, selling new customers, and it's not just about renewing customers, but you have to have marketing and have the funnel working. You have to have the information flowing into, product development and, customer engagement, and, it all fits together. And part of that is making sure everybody understands how they fit in the whole, as well as what the goals of the company are and how it's doing. And I mean, we had a company recently join the benchmarking who said that everyone they're so transparent. Not only do they share everything, pretty much everything from the board meetings, except for things that have to be, kept confidential. Everyone in the company knows everybody's salary and equity, share. Everything is completely transparent. And, that may not work for every company, but I thought that was so impressive. And then I just also think sharing benchmarks isn't just something you share with the board or with the senior management team, but it's really helpful to provide benchmarks as the context for everything, because everybody wants to see, how they're doing against peers and competitors, and it just really helps them. And numbers, your own company numbers provide the picture, but the benchmarks paint, or the numbers are sort of the line drawing, and the benchmarks are the color that help you really understand the picture. It gives it 3D depth, and I don't want to go too far with that analogy, but it just really helps, and it gets people jazzed, like, oh wow, we're doing really well here, or wow, we have a problem here, we need to do something about it. And it eliminates that. The board might have the experience to understand that without seeing, all the information, but it gives everybody context to understand how we really need to work harder. We have to be more efficient. It cuts through a lot of the groaning of, well, we work, we do this, and well, we're not quite getting it right. We got to get there.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting. Thank you both. Looks like going in the wrong direction here. So my last question would be, just looking at the list of folks on the call, so many friendly faces. We have VPs of revenue ops for very global scale. We've got directors of IT, we have VPs of sales ops, directors of sales ops, we have Salesforce architects on the call. I mean, really quite a wide range of folks. If there's one tip, and just so that, perhaps somebody on a RevOps team or a sales ops team can take away in this very, very critical job function of prepping board metrics. Lauren, it seems like benchmarks and sort of weaving that into the tail, and that's what OPEXEngine does so well, might be one of yours, but I won't steal your thunder. Kate, do you want to share?
Sure. So we've already talked about clearing your schedule, being ready for this. I mean, people would know in my company if when board, like David, just as you mentioned, what you see is other people in the company would know when it's board slide creation time, because we would just say, we would clear our schedules. And if anyone had a hot burning request, we'd be like, it's board, we have to work on the board slides. We'll get to it if we can, but it's really clearing your schedule. But for the other VPs of RevOps, or who's, ultimately owning the slides for sales or marketing, whatever position you're in, is bring in your team. This is a great path of promotion for them. It's good to get them involved early and have them see what it's like. I just, it really makes them feel like they're part of the process. So I would highly encourage the more people on your team you can help with the different sections of this, the earlier. It's just, I think it's worked out really well for me in my career, is pulling people in to help with this and really making them feel like they have impact and they're involved. And then, they end up becoming like real all-stars on your team, because they have the insight, they know what it's like. And, my boss did that for me. I was in my first board meeting a couple of years ago, and it just gives you a different perspective. And then when you build, you just think differently. So then even if you can't get them in the board meeting, you get them in the C-level meeting and you have them do some presentations so that they can start building their way up. And really, it just, there's a switch that goes off in your mind when you start working on board slides, when you've been very tactical at the business level, that can really help excel some people forward. So that is, what I would recommend, other than clearing your schedule, because that needs to be.
Oh gosh, I love that. I'll be teaching our Salesforce admin class next week through the week, and our reporting class 2 weeks from now. And something that I've always shared is, if you're preparing metrics, ask to sit in the meeting. Now, sometimes you can't sit in a board meeting, but even for a leadership team, if you're preparing metrics, if you can sit, like a fly on the wall in the corner, and just listen in, you learn so much about the context for those metrics. So I really like that idea of including everyone, and then sharing that story around the creation of the metrics. So Lauren, what can you share with us?
So besides benchmarks, which obviously I've dedicated a lot of time to that, and I think it's really important, I think it's really just having the discipline as a company to once a year sit down and say, here's the definition of the metrics, and then not change them, so that when Kaitlin and her team and the finance organization, you have to define what's a customer. Is General Electric one customer, or is it 20 customers because they have all these different divisions? Is McDonald's one customer, or is it 3,000, or Walmart or whatever? Is Europe the same customer as the US? All those kind of questions. You just pick an answer and stick with it, so that Kaitlin's not trying to adjust. Okay, how come this is in one area and not? Net retention rate, do you include, expansion or not? Just make a decision. Are customers lapsed if they didn't pay on the exact date? If they paid a week later, is that a renewal, or is that a lost customer who was, returned? Just make a decision and stick with it, because you can't be doing all that when you're preparing for the board meeting. And then you can change it next year.
All right, thank you both. Before we get to questions, I've got a couple more things to share. So we have a number more events coming up. I mentioned I'll be teaching our 5-day admin class next week. We still have seats available. You can find information about that and register right on our website. We also have a 2-day hands-on Salesforce report and dashboard workshop coming up November 2nd and 3rd. We have a twice monthly series called Dashboard Dojo. We'll be talking about new Salesforce report and dashboard features coming up on the 27th. We have another webinar coming up on ABM reporting for proven marketing leaders, and a couple more events coming up. November 16th, we have key integrations at each maturity stage. So some really great content. We're so thankful for having people like Lauren and Kate join us and share their experiences. We'll get to questions in a second. I do want to mention that OpFocus is hiring. We're growing. We've got a number of key roles that we're looking for folks: a CPQ consultant, senior Salesforce engagement manager, also looking for Salesforce architects, specifically around the community cloud. And I know we've got one question already. If you have others that you'd like to ask, we have the Q&A panel within Zoom. So our good friend Amber asked, as the owner of IT systems that are the sources of truth for these numbers, what can I do to best support the board slide prep process? So Amber is the Salesforce architect of Salesforce Architects, longtime Salesforce MVP. So also frequent participant in our architect roundtable. So glad to have you with us, Amber. Lauren or Kate, what do you think about Amber's question?
So I'll take a stab at this one. So Amber, stay close to the people who are building the slides. I would stay close to those people who are running the metrics, because I can think of an example of a couple of years ago, we changed a field in Salesforce and it impacted our board reporting because we just forgot. We were in a scramble to get things done. You know what it's like when you have these requests to change things. And so what we started doing going forward is in the field in Salesforce, if it had to do with a board metric, we literally would say, do not delete this, it has to do with the board. So like, that's one thing, but also just staying close with the analysts or your Salesforce admins, so that if changes are being made, that like everyone's just aware of what is being reported to the board, or if it will need to be reported to the board, just so that you can think about that going forward. Like if you have to map something, you have to go back in time and update things. And, if you do, like, what's the plan? Because it will impact metrics. So I would just say, stay close to that team and just really try to be as thorough as possible, with keeping track of those fields and just being aware of them.
I can totally second that, because I've been in situations where somebody changed a field and we didn't know about that. And then we go to produce the report and present it, and it's like, we don't have that anymore, or we have it in a different way, and like the numbers look totally different. So you don't have time at the last minute in the last week before the board meeting to diagnose that, figure it out, whatever.
Even if it's a new field and you've decided that, listen, just for this year, we're going to fill them in, we're not going to go back in time, that will come back to bite you for board slides. If you don't have, because we talked about trends, is you're always looking at trending. And if like you should just make sure that you're thinking about that when you're creating these new fields. And for time purposes, you're like, we're not going to go back now, but make sure you go back and think about that. Is that something you need to do for trending going forward? And maybe you decide it's a year. Like I've done that with some board slides, is like, we only have the data back for a year, but we're going to be tracking it going forward. That's something I've done, but also the blanks are something to keep in mind too, the blank values.
All right. Well, thank you both for that. It's certainly been a fantastic session. I'm so pleased to have you both join us. And, as we shared, we have a number of upcoming events and would love to have you all back for those. See if I can pull that list back up here. Come on. There we go. So November 9th for ABM reporting, and November 16th, key integrations at each maturity stage. And that I didn't mention earlier is featuring Workato. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David. And thanks to Kyle for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Nice to meet you, Lauren.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll stay in touch.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.